Greetings, friends, and bless you on this Friday. This is going to be my last missive to you. I had two questions come in from two of our students, your classmates, Daryl Six and Kim Powell, and I thought I would answer them together. They're two sides of the same coin, so this will be my last chance to connect with you. I have an idea to do one more thing, but here are the two questions, and I think they're good questions. First question from Daryl. As a pastor to artist, did you ever feel an obligation to say to someone, quote, "This isn't your calling. You're not an artist. Go make the world a better place by selling insurance"? Is there a moment where someone needs to hear that? How does a pastor help someone, specifically an aspiring artist, who they don't think is living in or headed toward their sweet spot in their calling? It's a wonderful question, and the answer is yes, except for the insurance part. And then Kim's question is if I would share a bit of my own vocational journey as an artist and arts advocate in my role as a pastor and priest. How would I answer some or all the 12 interview questions, which I don't know if I have time to answer all of them. Maybe I should do them in written. But let me just maybe share a bit of my story and then answer Daryl's question. Growing up in Guatemala City, I had one singular ambition in life, and that was to play soccer my whole life. That was not God's good, perfect, and pleasing will for me. I discovered in high school, I discovered too late that you should have started that career when you're 5. But when I was a sophomore in high school, I met a gentleman who actually shared a last name with me, Clyde Taylor, who had been a former U.S. ambassador to Paraguay. And I became captivated with the idea of working in the Foreign Service. And so then when I went to college, University of Texas, I studied international relations. I did a year abroad in Germany. I did a summer of study at Georgetown University in international relations. I interned at the Chilean embassy. I took the Foreign Service exam. I passed it. I went all the way to the regionals, at which point I was asked a series of ethically fraught questions about what I would do if I were in a certain situation in an embassy at a certain place in the world. And unfortunately, I answered all those questions wrong because I ended up choosing to advocate on behalf of the local community over against the U.S. administrative policy, which I always found to be problematic. And that's the problem with growing up as a missionary kid, is your sympathies are now extended to the global community. And so at that point they said, "Sir, this may not be your future." And so that was that. It was rather devastating. I also had a personal spiritual crisis of sorts my last term in college. And so then just months before graduating, I had no idea what to do with myself. And I knew about the seminary called Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, and had a sense that they were committed to integrating Christian faith, theology, biblical studies with everything in life, and that was of interest to me at some level. So I thought I'd go do a 2-year program and then go on to get a PhD in religion and politics, because that's what my undergraduate thesis had been written on. I arrived there, this is fall of 1995, and took a theology course with J.I. Packer and fell in love immediately with theology. I thought, this is the best thing ever. So I marched into the registrar's office and I asked them what their longest degree program was, because I had so much I wanted to learn. And they said, "Sir, well, it doesn't really work that way, but you could do, an MA and then do a THM." And so I said, "Okay, I'm going to do that." And that's what I did. So I did an MA in systematic theology and then a THM in New Testament studies. And the summers during my seminary years, I would fly back down to Austin, Texas. I would work as a waiter in a Tex-Mex restaurant to make as much money as I could. And then I also did these internships at a church called Hope Chapel. And I had no ambitions, no intentions, no aspirations to be a pastor or work for the church, any of that. None of that interested me. I think I had a little bit of a negative allergic reaction to church ministry work, not because I had a negative experience as a missionary kid. It just didn't do anything for me. But summers of 96, 7, 8, and 9, I began exploring the place of the arts within the life of the church, and I loved it. Now, let me just backtrack a little bit, and very, very briefly say that my last year at the University of Texas, I entered into the Rhodes Scholar application process, and was admitted to the first stage, which is an interview with 8 distinguished professors at the University of Texas. And I found myself in this vast 3-story high room, wood paneled, and me seated in a chair and in a half moon it was just like straight out of the movie. And it was 2 days of questions, of interrogation. And I'd applied for the position in politics, economics, and philosophy at Oxford. And the first day, I'd found myself doing the one thing you should never do in this kind of experience, and that is to say, I don't know. And I found myself saying, I don't know, repeatedly. 2 questions related to politics and economics, which was strange because that's what I'd studied. And so at the end of 2 hours of interrogation, my whole body had sweated through my suit. And the next day I knew I had round 2, and I was dreading it more than anything in my life. I was dreading sitting down in front of those very impressive, smart people and experiencing that same thing again. Well, mercifully, one of the women, Elspeth Rostow, who had been very significant in the 1950s and 60s U.S. economic policy development, started off by asking me a question. She looked at my applications and saw that I had some religious interests, and she said, David, in the Bible it says that Jesus was on the cross and that he looked down at his enemies and said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. What do you make of that? And then the next 2 hours, I answered all religious questions. The point of this is that I discovered that my deepest love was for religion, was for philosophy, for theology, for how people thought about God, and not necessarily for how people thought about politics and economics. And that's why I went to seminary, was because I thought maybe I'm more interested in the God part as it relates to politics rather than the politics as it relates to God. But I wish I'd known that at the beginning of my years at University of Texas. It wasn't until sort of this, I guess, critical crisis moment that I discovered it. And then 5 years of seminary, I thought I'm headed to a PhD, immediately to a PhD, religion and politics and so forth. And the last thing on planet Earth I wanted to do was work for the church. But every summer that I did an internship, I loved every part about it. I loved the work, I loved the people, I loved the projects. And yet at the end of 5 years of seminary, I found myself thinking, nope, no pastoral work, no church, none of that. That's not for me at all, because I had this idea, I think also maybe an infection in my heart, and I was not listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit. But at the end of the 5 years, I realized I was tired, I was exhausted. I'd been in school my entire life, and I wanted to know if any of the school meant anything to real people in their real lives, as it were. And the senior pastor at this church in Austin asked if I would be interested in coming full time. And long story short, I gave up the PhD, and I said yes, because I thought it would be interesting to know if any of my studies mattered to anybody in real life. And I started off, and it took me 2 years to get used to people calling me a pastor. And eventually I discovered, kind of going backwards, that God had called me to be a pastor. And I love the work. I absolutely love the work. But I've been kicking and screaming, as it were, against this because I had some infection in my mind about this, and I had not really stopped long enough to listen. But then we had some pretty heady years in those first 2, 3, 4 years as a pastor. A congregation of about 500 people, and a quarter of them were artists. And we did extraordinary things with the arts. We had small group studies. We had 3-week arts festivals in the summer. Half of the events took place in the city. We had art exhibits. We had these events, for artists to try out these new ideas. I think I've talked about that before. We had seminars and workshops. I would preach sermons every once in a while on the arts. We partnered with other churches and organizations. It was amazing. And a few friends of mine, well, one friend of mine in particular, we became very interested in film. And so we took film classes and workshops and joined Austin Film Society, and thought maybe this was our future, was film. And movie making began to take more and more and more time in my day and in my week and in my month. And my friend Jeffrey Travis realized that God was calling him. He was an engineer by day, but that God was calling him to be a filmmaker. And so we started going to film festivals, and I realized, man, this could be it. But I found myself dragging my feet on a number of areas of our partnership. And we were at a film festival, or flying back from a film festival in Seattle, and we were sitting at a restaurant in the airport, and he basically sat me down and said, hey, look, either you want this or you don't want this, but I feel like you're not pulling your weight. And so I just need to know, do you want to go all out on filmmaking and consider leaving your day job, or only doing it part-time? And I sat there and I realized that after 2.5 years of doing this film business, I didn't. That my passion lay with the care of artists. That's really what made me the most happy. And simultaneously, my primary really area of art making is playwriting. And I'd written a few plays, and we'd done a couple at the theater festivals here in Austin. And another friend of mine and I, we were starting to get traction and make things happen in the theater department, as it were, in Austin. And she had a similar, like about 9 months later, had a similar sit me down and say, hey, I think we could really go for it. But I need to know whether you're all in. And I realized I loved playwriting. I love writing plays. I love writing words on a page that actors would then enact. But I did not love it more than I loved shepherding people. And so those were in 2 moments where I thought the door was open, and I could have. I think God might have blessed it. But when I checked in with my own gut and my heart, and with the community around me, with the friends that could bear witness to me, the answer both times was no. That a full-time, all out, even if it was like part-time, not full-time. I mean, who can do their artwork full-time? But like really, really basically all nights and all weekends, all vacation times committed to the art. The answer was no. That I feel like God's call in my life and the grace that I was given was to help artists become whole human beings, and to love God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to be embedded in community, and to flourish and to succeed as much as possible given their stations and seasons of life as artists. That is what God called me to be. And I found that, as Frederick Buechner has said, the world's greatest need meets my deepest joy. That's where it lay. And so, Daryl, the answer wasn't to go sell insurance. The answer was be a pastor and be content. And it's okay to say no. To say no is a form of freedom, because it means that I get to say yes to all the things that are more primary. But here's the last thing I would say. I was also able to understand more clearly that I'm not only one singular thing. I don't have one singular punctiliar calling in life. I have a complex or a cluster of callings, some of which may be more dominant and some of which may be more secondary in different seasons or stations of life. And that certain seasons and stations of life I get to say yes to certain things, and even if it's difficult, I get to say no to other things. And that was part of my work as a shepherd, is to help people discern what is the grace that God has given to you in this season of life to say yes to, and then the trust that he will give you a grace to say no to other things. But that I have multiple callings. I have a calling to be a teacher, a calling to be a pastor, a calling to be a writer, a calling to be a husband, a father, and an organizer of things. But different seasons, again, different parts of my calling will weigh more and others will weigh less. And that while it's painful at times to have to say no in a certain season, is not no forever. That other seasons and stations, a yes may come back. And then here's the good news. Even if it's not in this lifetime, I have the rest of the new creation, which is an awfully long time to say yes to other things. So Kim and Daryl, thank you for your questions. That's just a little bit of my story. It isn't always easy. I don't always love what I do, and sometimes it's harder than other times. But I love being surrounded by artists. I love who they are. I'm married to one. I know it just doggone hard to be an artist in the world, in the church, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. But there's a grace, and sometimes the answer is you and I are God's provision of grace for one another, and that gives me great hope. So thank you guys. Bless you. Thanks for listening in. 16 minutes of my story, and looking forward to reading your final papers.